Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf ayin gimel. So we're continuing with our situation of we have all these animals mixed up together, intermingled. One of them is a problematic one, and all the rest were designated already for sacrifices. And what's bothering the Gemara, and we're going to see from the questions we continue to ask, is what's bothering all of us, right? Which is this idea that we end up sending all these animals to their death, right? Which number one is a problem because of tsar balei chayim, right? It's just torturous to animals. Number two, it's also taking sanctified items and disqualifying them, which we always want to avoid. So the first question the Gemara asked really is Vini batlu beruba. Why don't we say that it's just nullified by majority? Because again, maybe generally we won't say that, but in this case we want to allow that. That's what the Torah law is. Reinstitute the Torah law of majority, and that will basically resolve our problem. So like we've said, in laws of bitul, there's always situations where things are not batil, okay? And there's reasons why things aren't nullified. So the Gemara starts off by saying, it must be that the person who wrote our Mishnah held like Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir who said, an item that is sold by the unit, that is something that isn't nullified. And basically we went through, we saw where Rabbi Meir says it, but then we saw that there was a big machloket about what Rabbi Meir actually said. And as we said yesterday, animals could be sold as part of a flock, or they could be sold by number. Now, normally they're sold by unit, by animal, but sometimes they're sold in a flock and people don't even count, and therefore they come into the category of what we call kol shadar kolimano, anything that's usually sold by unit, even though not always. The problem is that, first of all, the rabbis disagree completely, okay? And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch paskins like the rabbis, but the Rama, okay, which is the Ashkenazi commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, who has his own approach often, actually holds like Rabbi Meir. Okay, and then there becomes this later debate, which opinion of Rabbi Meir, like Rabbi Yochanan or Rish Lakish. Anyway, that's just interesting in terms of psak. But basically, we're going to say our Mishnah holds like Rabbi Meir, but that only works if you hold like Rish Lakish, who says it's things that are mostly sold by unit. But if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan and say the only things that aren't nullified are things that are only exclusively sold by unit, then this would actually be nullified. And then you're back to your square one, back to your question. So the question now is according to Rabbi Yochanan, and for this we're going to come up with two more answers. And those are going to preclude Rabbi Yochanan. Even if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, maybe the Tana of our Mishnah, and it's, again, let's just be clear, even if you take the approach of how Rabbi Yochanan understood Rabbi Meir, in which case you can't explain our Mishnah like Rabbi Meir, then you have to take a different approach and say our Mishnah must hold like some other approach. Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, there's no way to explain our Mishnah, not according to the rabbis, and obviously Rabbi Akiva, who added, they just had a list of 6 or 7 items. But even Rabbi Meir, who adds a lot more items to that list, the only things added really are going to have to be things that don't include animals, because animals are sometimes sold by flock. I just want to also, in terms of understanding this approach, if you take Rish Lakish's approach of Rabbi Meir, it's an incredibly extreme position. It sounds like he's being lenient. He's being lenient in his definition of what Rabbi Meir says, but that's actually incredibly machmir, because what is Rabbi Meir saying? He's including many, many more things in the category of items that are never nullified. That's going to make a much more severe law in general, right? That brings us to severe laws rather than lenient, right? So it's a more broad position, which actually means it's a broad position within something of how many more things can we include in the category of items that are not going to ever be nullified. And that's why it's used to explain our Mishnah, which is a pretty extreme case. Which, by the way, if you say our Mishnah is just, okay, which we're going to do in this position, in this answer, and the next answer we're going to have altogether 3 answers to why this animal is not nullified, then what you're basically saying is this Mishnah is a unique opinion. Okay, it's not the mainstream opinion, although it depends how we hold in this. But right, if you hold by the rabbis, well, then the rabbis don't agree with our Mishnah, and then the animals would actually be nullified. The next answer is Amar of Papa, Hai Tana Tana de litra ktsiotu. So the next answer Rav Papa gives is that it's not Rabbi Meir in that machloket that we talked about the kilei kerem. No, it's actually a position, we're going to see, of Rabbi Yehuda and how he understands Rabbi Yehoshua's position. We're going to have a machloket within a machloket. The machloket's between Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. And then there's a machloket, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, about who said what in this machloket. And we're going to see Altogether, we're going to have four. Okay, there's going to be, right, what Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Eliezer said according to Rabbi Meir, what Rabbi Yehoshua, what Rabbi Eliezer said according to Rabbi Yehuda. In the end, though, there's really three positions because Rabbi Eliezer in one is going to match Rabbi Yehoshua in the other. But there will be three. It's not like they flip completely. Okay, so they just all move over one. Okay, you'll see in a minute or in a few minutes. What is litra? Litra is either a weight measurement or a volume measurement. There's a debate about what it is, but it's a measurement of ktsiot. Ktsiot are dried figs. Now, the reason is because you cut them. Ktsiya is to cut, and you cut off the stems, you dry them. They're dried figs. And after you dry them, you press them into something, into a jug, into a barrel, okay, into something, into a mold, like a round mold we're going to talk about, like a round shaped thing that then you press all the figs in, and then they would sell them from there. Okay, now sometimes they sell them as a whole bunch and they don't count them. And sometimes, now most of the time, they sell them without really counting them. So that wouldn't fit into either of the categories we saw before. But sometimes they sell them by individual fig. Okay? Because they sometimes sell them, and that's what we're going to say right now. Huda de Amal, okay, one of these of the four, which we said are really three opinions, one of the three opinions is going to be the very last one we get to, is going to say the following. Kol davar sheyesh bo minyan, afilu b'derabanan lo batil v'kosh kebedoraita. Okay, the issue of the litra ktsiot, first of all, we should just point out, is a rabbinic issue. That's what they're saying here. In a rabbinic situation, it's not going to be batel, though, even though it's rabbinic only. What's rabbinic about it? Well, we're talking about truma. Okay, the topic is truma. Truma is doraita. It's not derabanan. Okay, it's by Torah law, but only in dagan, tirosh, and yitzhar. Okay, that's grains, right? The 5 grains, the grapes, like wine, and olives, olive oil usually. But basically, we're going to say here we have figs. Figs, you take truma, but the truma is only rabbinic. And yet, we're going to have this opinion that says it's not batel. Okay, if you have truma and chulin mixed together, it's not going to be nullified because it's something that sometimes is sold by unit. So if we talk about before our two opinions, we had, right, this is a very extreme position because this is things that aren't generally sold by unit, but once in a while they're sold by unit, they're not going to be nullified. And that's what we're going to say our Mishnah is. If, right, our Mishnah must be following that position because we could put animals in that position. Okay, they're at least that, right? If not, maybe they're more so by minion, but it doesn't matter. As long as we follow this opinion includes anything that obviously is usually sold by unit, and even things that are only sometimes sold by unit, like these dried figs. And then all those things are never going to be nullified. That's a very extreme position, right? Before we had only sold by unit or usually sold by unit. Now we're going to say even if sometimes they're sold by unit, that's still going to make them important enough that they can't be nullified. So let's learn our opinion. So now, if that's in a Rabbanit issue, it's not nullified. All the more so in a rabbinic issue, you should think it would be more easily nullified. So, all the more so in a Torah issue, which is our issue, which we have a Torah item that's prohibited. We have sacrifices that are obligated by Torah law, right? And we're going to basically say, that we're sanctified by Torah law. We're going to say all that doesn't matter, right? It's not nullified. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita. Litra ktsiot. So you have this measurement of, amount of ktsiot, of dried figs. Shedrasa al pi igul. Now, they had these circle molds, and you put it at the top. Okay, so you had all these circle, you made these kind of cakes of figs, and then you put one on top of the other, and at the very top, you had, let's say, 20 of these that were round, these cakes of figs up, 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 okay? And at the top, you put one of truma. Okay, so you press these figs into a circle, into a mold, took it out of the mold, put it on top of this pile of other ones. Now, all the rest are chulin, just the one at the top is truma. The problem is that you now have, let's say, 20 of these, okay? And you don't know on which one did you put the truma at the top of. That's the first case. Second case, these are all going to be the same. Al pi chavit, you did it on top of a barrel. You, again, put all the pressed figs into a barrel. Then at the top of the barrel, you press more figs in. And the ones at the top were truma. And so now at the very top of this barrel, maybe it's even like on the cover of the barrel, you press these figs in, okay? But it seems like it's on top of all these other figs, the top layer. Top layer is figs that are truma, but now you have another 20 barrels like this, and you don't know which one was the one you put the truma on the top. Al pi kaveret. Okay, kaveret is perhaps some sort of basket. Ve'eni odebe is a kaveret rasa. Same exact situation. It's just a different implement, and you just don't know which one. So now what do you do? So logic would say, okay, if I asked you, based on anything you've learned until now, what would you assume? Well, since we know it's at the top layer, we just don't know top layer of which one. So if we want to talk about nullifying it, now truma is nullified 1 in 100. So you need 100 times. So if we have only 20 like this, and we're not sure which one has it on the top layer, the most intuitive position would be not nullified, right? And then what does that mean, basically? Well, I can assume all the figs at the bottom are chulin, but the ones at the top, I have to worry about, and we're going to basically call all the ones at the top forbidden. Not forbidden, meaning forbidden for a non-Kohen. Obviously, Kohen can eat them if they're all yours and you're not a Kohen. So you could sell it for kind of a cheaper price on the market for what we call demei truma. And you could. There's a way around it, but it's just the point is you can't just assume that they're all fine, right? And that only one of them is truma. I mean, whatever. There's ways to resolve it, but the question is right now that we're not getting to practicality. We're talking about, is it nullified or not? So if there are 100 barrels, we would assume then it's nullified. So let's see if that's what they say. Obviously, only one of them is going to say this. Rabbi Meir Omer. So Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Okay, it sounds a little strange, but Rabbi Meir says that Rabbi Eliezer says, Ro'in et ha'elyonot. This is a very interesting position, very lenient position. Okay, not what you would have thought intuitively. And this is because it's rabbinic. Okay, it's only truma d'Rabbanan, so we can be much more lenient. רואים את העליונות כאילו הן פרודות, והתחתונות מעלות את העליונות. Let's say our case, we only had 20 barrels, and one of those barrels has on the top of it figs. So it's not going to be batel. But what does Rabbi Eliezer say it is? Why? Because we don't look at it compared to the other barrels. We look at it compared to its own barrel. If you have, now assuming it's a big barrel, you have a lot of figs, way more than 100 times the figs, or at least 100 times the figs underneath than you have on the top layer. So we can look at the Elyonot, the ones on the top that are all mushed together and in one pile at the top, as if they're separated. Okay, kiluhem prudot, as if they're separated and mixed all through the entire barrel, even though, right, this isn't like wine where everything mixes up. This is pressed figs, right, dried figs that are pressed together. V'atachtonot ma'alot et ha'elyonot. And the lower ones overpower, so to speak, right? They can nullify the upper ones. So he basically says, because this is rabbinic, we can be super lenient here. And even though we know that that's not the case, we know that the figs at the bottom are definitely not truma, and the figs at the top are. In one of them, now we don't know. That's the problem. Each barrel we can view independently, and we can basically say each barrel is going to be permitted, assuming there's 100 times at the bottom over the top layer, right? And I shouldn't even call it the bottom, right? But the whole bottom part other than the top layer. We can basically nullify each one individually and say, oh, if that was truma, that's nullified in there. If that was truma, that's nullified. And then basically permit the whole thing. Okay, that's option one. Now, that was Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Eliezer according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer. Now, this is what I said, which is the most intuitive one. It's going to be the one that overlaps, right? Each one's going to have somebody who says this. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehoshua is the one who says it according to Rabbi Meir. If there's 10, if there's 100 covers, there's basically all these barrels with top layers on all of them, right? This, that the cover of it is filled with these figs. Im lav hapumim asarim v'shulayim mutarim. And if not, if you don't have 100, then basically we're going to say, well, so now what makes sense, right? If we don't have 100 and there aren't maybe two, like we said, there's only 20, then we're basically going to allow everything at the bottom, but not the top layer. The top layer we're going to assume is truma. Everything else we're going to assume is chulin. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Here comes the second approach. So now Rabbi Eliezer is going to say what Rabbi Yehoshua just said. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, yeshameh pumim ya'alu v'im lava pumim asurin v'chulei. They don't even bother telling you. Okay, you know that opinion. But here comes the opinion we were looking for. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehoshua says the following. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer, afilu yesham shlosh meot pumim lo ya'alu. You can even have 100 covers of barrels of whatever it might be. Lo ya'alu. There's no dinei bitul. Why is that? And that's what the Gemara said before. It's because it's davar sheyesh bo minyan. It's something that sometimes we sell by minyan. Sometimes you sell that top part of the figs in as a part, as a unit. And because they're sometimes sold as a unit, just that top part cannot be batil. So you can't nullify it with all the rest. And therefore, it's very hard to understand because we don't know the reality of what these fig cakes were at the top here. But sometimes they're sold as a unit, and therefore they can't be batil at all. So there you have your opinion, and then we could say, oh, our Mishnah matches that opinion. Again, putting our Mishnah is a very extreme opinion, right? It's not the mainstream opinion for sure. Rav Ashi Amar, third answer, okay, which is, you could say it as a third answer, a second answer. In other words, the way we started out, why is this animal not batil berov? Why is it not nullified in a majority? We answered this Mishnah, it's Rabbi Meir's position, kol shadar kol imanot, okay? But we said then, if you say that Rabbi Meir's Rabbi Yehoshua is explained the way Rabbi Yochanan understood Rabbi Meir, then you can't answer that. And for that, we give two answers. So you could look at it as two answers to if you don't accept that Rabbi Meir actually holds that way, and you think he says etchedar kol imanot, which is only if they're sold by unit, which doesn't include animals, then you're going to need some other explanation. And for that, we have two answers. You can either look at it as there's three answers altogether. It's either Rabbi Meir, or it's Rabbi Yehoshua, according to Rabbi Yehuda, or it's going to be this third opinion. Rav Ashi Amar, this is the most simplest answer. Okay, those were quite complicated answers. We had to go into a completely different, so you'll learn it, understand it, see the different opinions to get to our basic answer. Here we're going to have a very simple answer, which I think is the intuitive answer you would have answered at the beginning if I had asked you. Rav Ashi Amar, filu tema Rabbanan, even if you hold by the rabbis who disagree with these positions, right, the mainstream opinion, ba'alei chayim chashive velo batle. Animals who are alive have significance. Okay, they're animals. And you can't just say, oh, this animal is nullified. It's a being. Okay, when we talk about chashivut, it's not just things that are sold by unit. Maybe we'll talk in those terms when you're talking about inanimate objects, but you're talking about an animal. An animal has significance, and that's why it's not batil. Okay, that's a very simple, intuitive answer. Now we're going to move to the next part of our topic. Okay, we have three sections today. The first section was finishing up the previous sugya. Why isn't the animal nullified in rov? Now that we say, okay, the animal's not nullified, so it's there. In existence, there's a problematic animal, but it's also in a majority, right? Now, if we use laws of majority and statistics or probability, okay, more probability than statistics, if we go to probability, so there's rules about probability and rov. We've learned this many times, okay? Let's talk about some of the things that are good to know before we start this section of the daf, which is if you have, okay, famous 10 stores, 9 sell kosher meat and 1 sells non-kosher meat, and you find a piece of meat in the middle of them, right? In the middle of there's let's say a square, and basically, there's stores all around, and right smack in the middle, there's a piece of meat, and you don't know which store it came from. So based on laws of rov, which basically, I think in English, we just call it probability, okay, probability and majority rules, we say, well, if you find that piece of meat in the middle, this is what we call kol de parish, miruba kaparish. Whatever got separated, we assume it got separated from the rov. So if there's 9 kosher stores, we can assume that piece of meat is kosher. If there's 9 non-kosher stores and 1 kosher, we can assume the meat's not kosher. And we can go based on that. So even though there's a chance, okay, when you have 9 kosher stores and 1 non-kosher, there's a chance it came from that non-kosher store. But you can actually eat it because you can assume, based on laws of probability and majority, came from the majority of the stores. So that's if it's found in the middle. Now, if you went into a store and you didn't check which store you went into, and you can't remember after what store you went into, and you bought a piece of meat, that's a completely different rule. That's called kol kavua kemechza mechza dami. If it's in its fixed location, so the meat didn't move, right? You went into the store. The store was where it is. The meat was where it is. You went into the store and you just don't know, did I go into a kosher store or a non-kosher store? Now that's a 50-50 chance in halakhic rules of probability, even though theoretically it's not really. It's a 1 in 10 chance you went into the non-kosher store. But the question becomes, since it's fixed in its location, and there's lots of different theories about why this should be any different. I'm not going to go into that today, but The question is, okay, the simplest way of understanding this is, did you go into the store that was kosher, or did you go into the store that was not kosher, right? So since you went in and you went into the fixed place where it is, it becomes a 50-50 chance. Now, in 50-50, there's no majority. So you can't go by the majority, and you have to assume that it's possible that you went into the non-kosher store, and that meat is not permitted. That's called kol kavua kemechza al mechzadami. Anything that's fixed is 50-50. That's very important to understand for the next section of this Gemara. So the Gemara now suggests, you can see, they're bothered just like you are. How can we let all these animals die? And they're trying to come up with, aren't there better solutions? So, nimshach v'nikrav chad minayu. Why don't we just take an animal and sacrifice it? And then take another animal. Let's say we have 15 animals, okay? So we take animal number 1 out of the pack. And we say, okay, now forget what I told you right now about kol kavua and kol parish. Let's just put it out of your mind for 1 minute. What they're saying is, if I were to take one animal out, what do we say? Well, there's majority. We can assume that one animal was taken out of the majority. The majority animals are fine. And we can assume, right, the problematic animal is probably mixed in with that majority. So the one animal I took, what are the chances are that that's the animal that's problematic? So theoretically, I could take out an animal and sacrifice it. And I could keep doing this until I get to what? Till I'm down to 2. At 3, I could still do it because I could say, oh, the animal's still in the majority of the 2 that are left. When I get to 1, the last 2, I can't do it. Because if I pull out 1 and there's 1 there, it's basically 1 out of 2. It's 50-50 chance. But I can basically get rid of all the animals and use them. Not get rid of, I can use them. I can just keep taking animal, and just assume that the problematic animal is still in that other majority that's left. So that's what the Gemara suggests. Why don't we just pull out from the pack an animal 1 at a time and sacrifice them? So v'nema, and we'll just say, called a parish miruba parish. Now they're using this not in the exact right way, you'll see in a minute, but they're saying, and anything that separates, we assume it's separated from the majority, and the majority has the problematic animal in it, and I can assume this was, one of the 9 out of 10, right? We can assume it, like the 9 out of 10 stores, can assume it came from one of the kosher, one of the good animals, should be fine. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Nimshach? You want to take the animal out of where it's standing? That's its fixed location. If it's fixed, and that's why I said ignore for a minute, because it really doesn't fit into what I explained previously. Havale kavua. The animals at that point are fixed in their place. Turning now to Amud Vikol kavua kemechza mechzadami. And if I take something from its fixed location, it becomes a 50-50 question. Did I take a problematic animal or did I take a non-problematic animal? And it's a 50-50 chance I can't do that. So that's definitely not permitted based on the halachot of probability. Ella, so they say, no, that's not what we meant. Obviously, we know that's called, okay, or we don't know. Maybe they did mean it, but now they understand that's not an option. So, Ella nichbeshinu dininaidu. Nema called the parish miruba parish. They're animals. They're not pieces of meat that are inanimate. These are animals. You can get them to move. So if I just get the animals to move, then they all start moving. They're not in their fixed location anymore. And a Kohen can come and take that one, and a Kohen can come and take that one. And then we can say, oh, look, all the animals, right, called the parish miruba parish. Oh, there's one over here. Well, this one came out from the majority. I can assume it goes by, right? Most of them are fine, so it must be fine. That would be a good solution. Why don't we do that? And for this, we're going to have Rava answer 3 different answers. Rava's going to try one. We're going to reject it. Rava's going to try another. We're going to reject it. He's going to try a third. We're going to finally say, oh, that must be the reason. Okay, and that's going to finish our second part of the daf. The third part is going to be an outgrowth of that, of another statement Rava says about that, which we'll get to soon. So Rava, now each time Rava is going to say, actually, it's really permitted, but it's a gzera. Okay, it's a decree. The rabbis decreed for the following reason. Theoretically, this could work, but I'm a Rava, and the next 5 words I have in parentheses, so I'm going to skip them. What's he worried about? He's worried, and this is with Rashi's help, okay, because Rashi explains it a little bit better, that we're assuming, okay, let's start with our case. We start scattering the animals around. Now, one of them is a shor and iskal, but each Kohen takes an animal, And each one we can say, okay, called the parish, we parish, everything's fine. They go, they slaughter the animals, all fine. But then they have the blood and the imurim, the parts they're supposed to burn. What if they go at exactly the same moment, 10 kohanim? Now, again, this is a decree that in case this were to happen, this would be a problem. Let's say we have 15 animals, and 10 kohanim take 10 of those animals, and they basically sprinkle the blood and burn the parts on the altar. It doesn't matter either or, but let's just go with the blood because we know that's the main part of the korban. And they sprinkle the blood all at the same time. Now, what do you have? You have a majority, 10 out of 15, of animals, right? That you sprinkle the blood of them all at the same time. Now, the problem here is the laws of probability say that the problematic animal is in the majority, which means that you've now, based on laws of probability, have sacrificed an animal on the altar, which was not allowed to be on the altar. Again, we don't know what's true or not. It actually could be in one of the five, but it doesn't matter because the laws of probability state that the problematic animal is mixed in with the majority. That was what allowed us to take the other ones. We could take each one individually because as long as there's a majority still left, we can assume it's there. But now that we're using a majority and we're sacrificing them all at the exact same moment, the laws of probability say that the problematic animal is in the majority. So even though before we claimed it was in the extra five that were left, because when we took number 10, right, there were still five left, and it was in that majority. Now we switched the reality and we say based on laws of probability, if they all did it the exact right, as long as they do it separately, it's not a problem. Because each time you do it, there's a majority against it to say, oh, it's not that one because it's in the majority, the problematic one. But when you do 10 all at the same time and sprinkle the blood on the altar, you're going to have a problem because then it's based on laws of probability, the problematic one is in that 10, and then you've sacrificed an animal that is not allowed to be sacrificed on the altar. So Rava says, we're not going to allow the Kohanim to take the animals because we're going to assume, no, not we're going to assume, we're making a decree just in case if we allow that, theoretically we could get to a situation where they all poured the blood at the same time. Now, Rashi adds a certain phrase, which comes up a lot when we have things like this. Efshar litzantzem, Rashi says. What that means is you can synchronize that kind of thing. It's definitely possible. Some things are not possible to do at the exact same moment. But what they're saying is the placing of the blood on the altar by 10 different Kohanim theoretically could happen at the exact same moment. Okay? So that's the problem. But I told you already we're going to reject the first two answers of Rashi. So, of Rava. So, a rabbi comes over to Rabbi and says to him, Elame'ata megisa asira. What you're saying is really something preposterous. Why? The megisa is the vessel in which they held either the blood or the imurim, the parts that are going to be burnt on the altar. Now, what Rashi explains here is that basically, okay, maybe we'll even read Rashi, so he just says it very well, okay? Elame'ata megisa asira, klomar. Okay, if we started out, everybody, right, the animals were wandering, so they were already not in their fixed location. Each Kohen took, and that was all fine. The kol chad da'amar demiruba parish. Each one we could say it came from the majority, and right, it's separated from the majority, and therefore the problematic one's in the majority, and this one's okay. Ushchatan, and then he slaughtered it. V'kibel damam b'megis. Okay, and then he accepts the blood in this bowl. Bechazakashu kashil. Now, at this point, we assume everything's fine, right? Because so far, right, we've been going by laws of majority and everything's good. And then we revert back to saying it's problematic. And it's preposterous to think that you could basically go through this process. Everyone could take the animal. At this point, we've removed the possibility. It's what I said before. At first we thought it was in the five that were left, right? And now we're moving it and we're saying it's now in one of the 10 that are here, right? It doesn't make sense that we permitted this. And then later when it's in a blood form, we're going to all of a sudden say, oh, now it became problematic. That's very odd. It doesn't really seem to work logically. So he changes it. He said, fine. We're actually worried about the earlier stage. It never was permitted because again, it is permitted, but we're going to forbid it just in case the following scenario would happen. A decree, mishum shema yavo asara kohanim bevat achad v'yikchu. What we're worried about is if the animals are scattered and maybe 10 Kohanim will take them at exactly the same moment. And if the 10 Kohanim take it at exactly the same moment, what's the problem? We're going to end up with it's going to be in the majority of what the 10 people took. The problematic one, because by laws of majority, if they all took it at the exact same moment, to which the Gemara says, Bevat achat mi efshar. Says that's not possible. We said before, efshar l'tzamtzem, right? Again, Rashi add those words, but it's based on this. That theoretically, you could have them all at the same moment pour the blood. But to catch animals is not an easy task, okay? You have a big animal that's moving around. You have to grab it. And they're wandering in all different places now because you've scattered them. The chances are that 10 Kohanim are going to come and take them at the exact same moment and catch them and stop them at the exact same moment is very unlikely. So that's not something that could really happen. And therefore, we're obviously not going to make a decree for something that can't really happen. So we've rejected Rava's second answer. Now we're going to have finally Rava's third answer. Ela amarava mishum kavua. This is a reasonable decree, as opposed to the others, which was, kind of a rare. It would be rare or unlikely this would actually happen. But and also according to the first one, we said it doesn't make any sense. Also, that we would permit something and then later go back to forbidding it. But according to this last answer, we basically say is theoretically, you could scatter the animals. And if Kohanim would come and take them, it would be fine because each time you would take one, it would be coming from separating from the majority. We can assume it goes by what the majority is and the problematic one is left in the batch, and that would be fine. But if we allow it in that situation, and this is the classic slippery slope, if we allow it in that action, people might think that it's allowed even if they're still standing in their place. They might not remember that detail or realize that was important, that they have to scatter the animals. They might have seen once it happened, they scattered the animals, but that could have just been by chance, or they might not have noticed that element. And they might come to actually do it in a place when it's kavua, and that would be problematic. And by Torah law, it's going to be problematic because there is no laws of rove there, and then the animal's not nullified, and then we brought an animal on this altar. That's it. That's not allowed to be on the altar, and that's the reason why we don't allow this to happen. Okay? So, again, sugya number one was, why is this not canceled? Why is this not batal b'rov? Then we said in the end, right, the animal has significance either for whatever reason, either because it's mostly sold by unit, it's right, or it goes by this other opinion about selling by unit, or just because animals are significant. And then, even if we don't go by that kind of majority, we should go by a statistical majority and laws of probability and say, well, when I separate it out, right, assuming we've scattered the animals and they're not in their main position, that should work, but it doesn't work because we're worried that people might do it when they're in their fixed position. That leads us to sugya 3. Because the third sugya today is another statement of Rava. Rava says, based on what I just said, that the rabbis decreed that we can't scatter the animals because they might come to then do it in a fixed situation. So now if we have this situation where we have, let's say, 15 animals, and one of them is a problematic animal, we have to leave them all to die. So comes Rava and says, Hashta da amre Rabbanan lo nakriv. Now, according to this, just be clear, and that's what Rava is saying, it's a rabbinic decree that we have no resolution to this, okay? Just to be clear, the whole Mishnah is all a rabbinic decree. Now, this shows the power of rabbinic decrees. Comes Rava and he says, Ikariv, what if they went against this rabbinic decree and scattered them, took an animal, statistical majority says this is fine? Well, lo meratze. It does not work. And if that was your korban, you'd have to bring a new one. Okay, what he's basically saying is the rabbis have a lot of power. They made a decree, so much so that once they decreed that this is not a solution, if someone goes against that, it's their korban, then the korban is not going to be accepted. Okay, fine, that sounds reasonable. I mean, it sounds a little harsh, but makes sense because the rabbis have to also protect their decrees. So they're basically saying this is completely not good. The problem is, we're going to go back to Masechet Kinim. Okay, now don't worry because this is the actual very simple part of Masechet Kinim. It's actually the whole basis of the complicated cases that we got to before. Okay, we didn't see this in order, but they kind of build up. Okay, so we're going to go back to the real basics. So this will not be complicated at all. Eitive Rav Huna bar Yehuda l'Rava. So Rav Huna bar Yehuda comes and says to Rava, wait a minute. Based on, we're going to bring two different Mishnayot and Kinim. One is from the first chapter, and then one is in the third chapter that's based on, that's going to kind of springboard from that first one. So, Chatat Shenit Arva Ba'ola. In the first chapter, it says, Parak Aleph Mishnah Bet, a chatat that gets mixed up with an ola. So now we're talking about birds, but it should be no different birds, animals. We have birds that get mixed up. So the woman, let's say, decides, right, she has a child, she brings two birds to the temple. Again, it could be all different ones. So let's just assume this Yoledet, a woman who gave birth and owes this korban. She brings two birds, one's a chatat, one's an ola. They get to the Kohen, and the Kohen gets confused, which is a chatat, which is an ola. Or perhaps it's multiple korbanot that different people brought, and they were designated already, and they don't know, he doesn't know which is which. So we have a chatat shenitarva ba'ola, va'ola shenitarva b'chatat. Okay, either which way. We have chatat mixed up with ola mixed up with chatat. We have a combo. Now remember, ola goes at the top, chatat goes at the bottom. Right? The whole blood and all the slaughtering is at the top for the ola and at the bottom for the chatat. Afilu echad biribo, even one chatat mixed up with 10,000 olot. You see, it's the same language as our Mishnah. Yamutu kulam. Really same language. They all have to be left to die. You can't do anything with it. Okay, which is strange because we were talking about what if you did. Okay, well, that's the next part. So comes the Mishnah in chapter 3, and that was our chapter that we talked about. What if, so bamed dvarim amurim, so when do we say that yamutu kulan, that's the law? Bikohen nimlach. That's if the Kohen realizes the problem and goes and asks a question about it and says, okay, what do I do? He goes to the rabbi and he says, listen, the chatak, or maybe like the Kohen in charge there who knows the laws, right? In the temple, there's like the person there, or, maybe the Sanhedrin that's sitting in the Beit HaMikdash. Maybe you understand now why there's a Sanhedrin sitting in the middle of the Beit HaMikdash. So he goes there and he says, listen, I have this problem. This got mixed up. Well, if he goes and asks, they're going to tell him they all have to die. However, what if we have a Kohen who thinks he knows better and he doesn't ask? And maybe he doesn't care. We don't know what. But he doesn't. And he just goes and does it anyway. Now, that's parallel to our case. Because what does Rava say? They all have to be left to die. That's the Mishnah, right? And he explained the Mishnah. And it's all because of a rabbinic decree. And if they go ahead and do it anyway, Rava says, it doesn't get accepted. But that's totally not what it says in Kinim. Because in Kinim, it says they all have to die, just like our Mishnah. But if the Kohen does it anyway, well, that's where we get to all the cases we saw. So again, we're going to just go with the very simple. In this case, basically, so if he does, asa'an lemala, if he does them all at the top of the altar, and he sacrifices them. Now we know that there's, X number of, right, we have a combination, a mixture. We don't know which was chatat, which was ola, but we know that, let's say, one was chatat and the rest were ola, or the reverse. It doesn't matter, okay? But we do know how many olot there were. So if he does them all above, mechza kasher, mechza pasul. Okay, it could be 50-50. It depends what got mixed up. But if it's, let's say, equal amounts of chatats and olas that got mixed up, then, half of them are going to be good because they were all done at the top. Half of them are disqualified because they were supposed to be done at the bottom. Half of them are good because they were done at the top. And that completely goes against what Rava said. Rava said, if they're supposed to die and you sacrifice them, they're not accepted. This sounds like they're completely accepted, at least if they were done in the right place. So 50% were done in the right place. If you do kulan lamata, right? Lamata, mechza kasher, mechza pasul, same thing. It's just the opposite. All the chatats, all the sin offerings will be good. All the ola will not be good. Echad lamata, echad lamala. This is already irrelevant for our purposes because in this case, if you do one above, one below, and that's where we got up to all those crazy cases, shneim psulo, then they're both disqualified. Okay, because you don't know, maybe the ola was brought up at the bottom and the chatat was brought at the top, and then you can't allow any of them. And, right, this is all based on, the Mishnah says, we already know this, and we had to say this in the beginning, otherwise you wouldn't have understood anything. Shani omel, because the law is, chatat kreva lamala v'ola kreva lamata. Okay, this is all based on the fact that the chatat is done at the bottom, the ola is done at the top. So we have a contradiction here. And this is what Rav Huna, Rav Huna bar Yehuda brought this as difficulty to Rav and said, how could you say these aren't accepted? Because in a parallel case with the birds, if the Kohen doesn't ask and he doesn't leave them to die and he sacrifices them, they actually work, right? At least the ones that could work, okay? In the scenario where it could work, right? There might be other problems there that it's brought in the wrong place, but if it's brought in the right place, it actually works. So what's the answer? And with this, we'll finish for today. Ela ha kemanda amar baalei chayim nidchim, ha kemanda amar baalei chayim einam nidchim. Okay, this is a machloket we've seen before. Are animals, when they're alive, rejected? There's a concept that if you have a sacrifice, it's supposed to be sacrificed, and it gets rejected from being sacrificed, something happens, and it's rejected, we will not accept this on the altar anymore. But is that only after shechita? Does that kick in only after shechita? After shechita, everybody agrees that if you had an issue, your korban all of a sudden became disqualified for some reason, you will never be able to bring that on the altar because God doesn't want things that are rejects. Okay, it was a reject. But when the animals are still alive and it was designated for a sacrifice, it can't be used like these cases, right? So the bird, let's say, right, it can't be used because they got mixed up, or the animal because it got mixed up with these other animals. It was rejected from use, but it's still alive at this point. It hasn't been slaughtered yet. So there's a big debate about once something is rejected in its lifetime, is that considered a rejected item or not? When the animal's still alive, since it's not yet, it is designated for sacrifice, but it's not yet slaughtered for sacrifice, maybe it's not yet rejected. So Rava, who doesn't accept this korban at all, says that we don't accept it because the animal was rejected. Once it got mixed up, it was a reject. And we don't accept rejects even from when they were still alive. And the bird Mishnah basically holds that no, when it's alive, it's not considered a reject. So if it's slaughtered for the purposes of a sacrifice and brought on the altar and it's done the right way, meaning it was done at the top and it was an ola, so it's actually not rejected because the rejection happened when it was still alive. And that's why this source doesn't contradict Rava at all, because it's coming from a different school of thought about the issue of rejection regarding the altar. And with that, we finish for today. We'll ask another question on this, which is going to really go into tomorrow's stuff. So we'll leave it right now. So what we did was 3 sugyot. The first sugyot we finished from yesterday, which is why isn't this animal nullified in the majority? And that we've reviewed already. There were 3 answers altogether. And again, the 2 today were basically if you can't hold, like if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan's position of Rabbi Meir, and then you can't say the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, so we'll give 2 other possibilities. Then we suggested, why don't we use laws of rove and probability and basically a statistical majority and say, oh, well, if we scatter them, then we can say, oh, each one we took was from the majority and it's okay. And Rava, after trying 2 other attempts unsuccessfully, says in the end it's because we're worried that if we allow it when we scatter them, people will think it's okay when they're fixed. And when they're fixed, it's really not okay because kol kavua kemechza mechza, that means it's a 50-50 chance, and that doesn't work. And then Rava said, and because of this rabbinic decree, if you actually sacrifice it anyway against the law, against this rabbinic decree, even though theoretically it actually would be okay, but rabbinic decrees are so strong that your korban will not be accepted. And then we said, wait a minute. What about the case in Kenan where we do accept it, even though he wasn't supposed to do it and they were all supposed to be left to die, but the Kohen did it anyway? How do we say that in certain situations, some of them will be accepted? And the answer is they're both from 2 different schools of thought. Are animals rejected or not rejected when they're still alive? With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.